Hello, my name is Jeff Ullman. I'm a contractor to the Colorado Water Conservation Board. This recording is the outcome of a rain-on mesh sensitivity study that AECOM conducted for CWCB in the summer of 2020. This recording provides an overview of the efforts and summarizes the findings, and it's the first of 3 recordings as summarized in the next slide. The deliverable for this effort was a recorded 3-part series totaling 2 hours and 21 minutes. With this session being an overview to cover the project purpose, background, process, and findings. Now the process and inputs are further detailed in the appendices along with a narrated review of the data and charts and graphs. Appendix A covers hydrologic variations or changes in the way that precipitation was applied to the model. Appendix B covers hydraulic variations or changes in the way that water flowed through the model. And each of these recordings can be located on CWCB's YouTube channel. I wanted to include this slide just to make the presentation a little bit more personable so you can see who actually worked on the project. So in the upper left, Twee Patton was the project sponsor and funded the project and helped direct its goals and objectives. I'm in the lower left, Jeff Ullman. I managed the project with the team on the right side. So Danny, Grant, and Isaac in general did the hydrologic variations, and Matt and Meredith did the hydraulic variations, but we all worked together on this exciting project. A bit of background for context before we jump into why we did the study and what we were trying to answer. I wanted to explain, first of all, what rain-on mesh modeling is. It's a way of applying excess precipitation to a model mesh, or often called a grid. And when I say excess precipitation, that is the portion of runoff, the portion that does not infiltrate. So we would use what's called an excess precip hyetograph, and that's basically the shape of precipitation over time that's applied to the model mesh. And then that's applied to every single cell, and we used HEC-RAS. It's applied to each individual cell and then routed or transferred as it travels through the cells in the mesh. And so we used this study to vary hydraulic and hydrologic variations to assess the sensitivity of the output results, which is often in terms of discharge, in terms of flows, or stage, or elevation. And we did this with hundreds of 2D rain-on mesh simulations using the most current version of HEC-RAS 507. And this study was funded in order to help inform future modeling decisions and to better understand what is reasonable uncertainty. And the reason why I say it in that way is there is engineering judgment that goes into the selection of these parameters, and there's a degree of uncertainty that is considered within reason or best practice. So this is to assess what that might be. And so this slide summarizes our project team's study objectives. We wanted to look at the relative influence and impact of the different H&H parameters on the model outcome. This way we can understand the knobs that can be turned, and not just which direction they might move the results, but by how much. Another way of saying that is what we knew previously qualitatively, we wanted to understand better quantitatively to understand what that actual impact is. And based on those results, we can make better future decisions based on quantified rather than subjective qualified information. And this will also help us defend decisions when H&H analyses are either questioned or scrutinized, and it'll help substantiate best practices moving forward using this example data in terms of what you should select for different regions based on your watershed characteristics. In terms of specific questions that we wanted to answer, these are a bit more technical in nature. We wanted to understand how much variability, to what degree do we see fluctuation in discharge and elevation when we change differing temporal distributions, or when we change the applied precipitation depth within the confidence intervals, or the antecedent moisture conditions which affect the loss calculations and runoff, or when we change the hydraulic settings in the model, or the mesh, or its structures, and etc. And then the next question is, what's the cumulative impact if you vary all of these different assumptions? Like, what is the total net spread when you could select between different variables? And the ultimate goal in understanding this is to then provide suggestions by different groupings. So for if you have specific basin drainage characteristics, or you're going to select geography, what can you know from this study that would then help you better select the appropriate input assumptions? And that's what will be at the end of this presentation. An important distinctive of this study is that the objective was to look at the sensitivity of how input parameters affect the results, and not necessarily to determine what was the most appropriate parameter to be used for the study area. So if you look on here, I've just got an example of several different input parameters that might affect hydrology. And usually we just use the median straight in the middle. So we'd use the 50% confidence limit for the depth. For shape, often what's used is SES type 2, just traditionally what's been used. For duration, depends where you are, it could be a 6-hour, 24-hour, and for loss, it's usually the antecedent moisture condition type 2. But let's say you wanted to use the 10% confidence limit or the 90% confidence limit. How would that affect your results? For the shape, if you're looking at NOAA Q1 D1 or Q4 D9 might appear on this upper end, whereas down here it might be the Q1 D9, and in the middle might be a quartile 2 decile 5 or something like that. And for durations, you could go anywhere from a half hour to 96 hour, and you have different antecedent moisture conditions, whether it's type 1 or 3. So we wanted, by the study, we would vary along each of these different parameters to see how it would impact the results and get a sense for what had a larger impact than others. This slide summarizes the overall process that we went through for the sensitivity study by 4 major groups. So the first one's going to be on developing metrics. This is how we were going to measure the impact, and for this we looked at peak discharges, at stage and elevation, and at timing. And some of this was looked at in terms of maximums, and others was hydrographs over time. In terms of the inputs into the model that actually varied, again, we did 2 different sets. We looked at hydrology and hydraulics. So hydrology is a study of applied water. It's how much precipitation is being applied to the model, where hydraulics is how that water then moves through or routes through the model. So for hydrology, we varied things such as the storm duration, its distribution, the depth that was applied, and the curve number used for loss calculations for runoff. For hydraulics, we varied the mesh, including how crossings were handled, the size and the alignment, the roughness coefficients, and the terrain underneath it, as well as computational settings assumed in the model and how initial storage would be handled. So once we had the variables, varied those, got the results from doing the simulations. So we used cloud computing to do 182 hydrologic variations, and we extracted information at internal connections for 47 different locations within the larger model. For the hydraulic variations, we extracted it at 18 different locations across 21 simulations. We compiled all this data and analyzed it, which is the analysis won't be in this recording, but it'll be in Appendices A and B. And we looked at hydrographs, both stage and flow, and we looked at maximum peaks and maximum elevation versus drainage area. We looked at percent change when we're comparing variations within each other, and we also used plots and charts to do this comparison. With that high-level overview of the process, let's look at the specifics of where and how. So we selected a study area in the Trout Creek watershed that's upstream of the Teller-Douglas County boundary. So if you see here, it's pointing to Teller County, something like this, and then that white area is the watershed that we studied. So it's just northwest of Colorado Springs and south of Denver. And we chose this area. It's got about 85 square miles total, but it has a fair amount of elevation as well, from 7,500 up to 10,500. As for reasons why we chose it, and you can see here's the same area and here's a county boundary. There's a variety of slopes in here. This is in the foothills to maybe mountainous areas of the county. So we've got areas that are relatively flat, that have drained into kind of a meandering channel, but then many steeper channels that are coming out of smaller basins into the larger channel. This is an area that we had done existing base level engineering model using RAS 507, the current version, so we're able to leverage that for this project. And this is a fairly undeveloped area, largely forested, so there's a relatively homogeneous land cover, which is nice since HEC-RAS can only take one applied excess precip hyetograph, meaning you can basically only apply one curve number to it. A bit more information on the hydrologic study area itself. This is that same watershed that you saw outlined on the earlier piece. It's 85 square miles, like I mentioned, with the elevations here of 7,500 to 10,500, and Pikes Peak is somewhere in this corner here. On that note, actually, to orient you a little bit better to the watershed, here's Woodland Park, here's Pikes Peak. Fluorescent, and the boundary between Park and Teller, Cripple Creek's down here as well, and then here's where it starts, right at that Douglas County and Teller County boundary, moving up Trout Creek, like so. And on the right, you can see all the different connections that we use. We use 47 different internal model connections, and this is how we extracted information from the model. They're basically evaluation transects where we would export out a stage hydrograph and a discharge hydrograph, and that's how we would evaluate our information. And of these 47 connections, some, such as these up on the upper portions of the watershed, had very small drainage areas, like 0.1 square miles, to where moving down, 10, 20, and then all the way at the bottom of 85 square miles. So this whole model was used for all the hydrologic variations. As for the hydraulic variations, a subset of that model is used. So again, here's the larger model that we just saw with the 47 connections. This red area here is this portion, a smaller portion of the model that we're using for the hydraulics, about 29 square miles compared to the 85 square miles. And we've got 18 connections in here that we're using for drainage areas anywhere from 0.1 to 22 square miles down here. And this is what we use to change different components in the mesh, etc., which you'll see on subsequent slides to evaluate the hydraulics. This slide summarizes the hydrologic analyses that were done and the variations therein. So there's 182 different simulations that were applied to that larger model that we looked at, the one that had the 47 connections across 85 square miles. So with those different simulations, we applied different hydrology, or different precipitation curves, and we would vary the distribution and the duration. So we looked at SCS type 2 at different NOAA distributions and at nested distribution as well, and durations anywhere from a half hour up to 24 hours. We also looked at the depth confidence limit. I mean, typically studies are done using the median, or the 50%, but we looked anywhere between the 10% to the 90%, and then we also varied the curve number. Usually the antecedent moisture conditions 2 is used, that's the average, but we looked at anywhere from 1 to 3. Now, what was fixed across all of these analyses is any of the hydraulic components on how the water moved through the model. So we left the terrain unaltered, the settings in terms of the Courant number equal to 1.5 and a minimum time step of 1.8. We used a mesh of 200-foot nominal with 50-foot refinements along the streamlines. We used the same break line and V-notches throughout the whole modeling exercise for the hydrologic piece, and same mannings that were based on the National Land Cover Database. And I should note that all of these simulations that were done were the 1% or the 100-year event with no depth area reduction factors applied. And like I mentioned earlier, we extracted stage and flow hydrographs at each of these connections, and that's how we analyze the data. And looking at the hydrologic piece, when you look at Appendix A in particular and get into the data, there were 3 connections in particular along the same stream that we often showcase data to show that impact along the same stream with increasing drainage area. This slide summarizes the hydraulic variations that were conducted as part of this study. So there were 21 different simulations conducted, and we varied the crossing types, such as like a culvert or bridge, the storage and how that was accounted for, the mesh alignment and the cell size, the Manning's end roughness, the underlying terrain resolution, and the computational settings. Now, what was held constant across each of these simulations was that a custom nested hydrograph was used, and it always used the 1% event with a 24-hour depth and assumed curve number that was based on the antecedent moisture condition. And we extracted the stage and flow hydrograph information at each of the 18 connections in the model. Now, the ones that you'll see that are featured most frequently when we're looking at specific hydrographs are these three shown here. So connections 3, 8, and 21, just showing a diversity of different drainage areas. Now, because this is only an overview, we're not going to look at specific results here, but we'll skip to the conclusions or findings. Should you be interested in reviewing the results, please watch Appendix A for the hydrologic variations and Appendix B for the hydraulic variations. Or if you're loving this as much as I am, you can watch them both multiple times. I did want to include a couple representative graphics at first, though, to illustrate the types of exhibits that you might expect to see in those appendices. So these are snippets, or maybe we can call them teasers, from the appendices. So data were analyzed in flow and stage hydrographs at individual connections, like you might see here for different distributions, or for different modeling conditions as shown on this graphic. Peaks were also plotted by drainage area across scatter plots to test different hydraulic and hydrologic variations. And then also we aggregated them across all connections to see their spread or distribution, such as shown in this whisker plot here. Now, Appendices A and B, they dive into the data with narrations on each of the slides, and they can be found on our YouTube channel. So that concludes the study overview regarding background, process, and components. So now I'm going to summarize the findings from the study. First, I'll provide a high-level summary of the main points that are distilled for a non-technical audience, and then we'll repeat the detailed findings that are more technical in nature as captured in Appendices A and B. For those that are less interested in the nitty-gritty of the technical implementation, this slide summarizes pretty much the key findings across all of the different areas that we considered for the study. So you can see on the column headings on the right-hand side, these are the three different areas that you might consider in terms of what determines what. So for example, the study objective, what that would determine for how the rest of the study is implemented. The watershed properties, such as its geographic location, the regional climate, just conditions of the watershed, land cover, urbanization. And then the third one would be sensitivity analysis and calibration. So actually looking at the results, how sensitive are they to your parameters and how well does it match what you're trying to validate against. So I'll run through these and kind of summarize what we're talking about here. So in terms of degree of desired detail, whether you're going for a zone A as an approximate or AE as in detailed, or if this is in an urban setting, your study objective of what you're actually trying to do is going to govern how the rest of this is going to be implemented for the most part. Now, your watershed properties are going to play a little bit part in this based on if it's a urbanized area, or let's say it's a meandering stream versus a canyonized one. Your watershed will influence how much detail you'll put in your model. As for a conservative approach, what is the end user's appetite for how to display risk information? If they want to be more conservative, you might consider a hydrograph like the nested hydrograph, which considers the max intensities. You might actually remove some of the storage. Instead of using a dry train, you might apply initial water. How you model structures, whether it's a V-notch or an internal connection, is going to depend on whether they would like to be accurate or err on the side of conservatism. So that's going to be based on the study objective and end users. Now, the watershed is going to play a little bit part of that as well, such as for the storage, what's going to be governed by the actual watershed conditions. As for the storms distribution selection, this is whether you would use like an SES type 2 or nested or NOAA. That's going to be a little bit tied to the study objective like we just discussed, but then also largely based on where it's located regionally. But then when you get into specifics like, which decile within a quartile, that may be something that you refine by looking at your results to see how well you can match a historic event during calibration. As for storm duration, this is something, again, that's going to depend on the watershed largely in terms of the drainage area. For small drainage areas like less than 10 square miles or something, you might consider a 6-hour or less duration, unless you're out in the south or something, and then you might use a longer duration, but that could be looked at and compared to your actual discharges. Your mannings and roughness, that's going to largely be determined by the land cover, something like the National Land Cover Database, so that's what your starting point will be, but you'll certainly refine those as part of calibration. Similarly with the model domain, that'll often be driven by the terrain and then also where you have changes in the storm distribution, but then also it's going to be based on where you have data for calibration, where gauges are located and actual data sources that you can calibrate your model to. As for the curve number, that's going to be a lot based on soils and land cover, but ultimately in the end it is a knob that can be turned to better calibrate your discharges and your stage as well. As for the watershed storage and restart file, that's going to be based on kind of the initial disposition for how they'd like to handle that in terms of end users. But it's also going to be driven by watershed properties. Like if it's a steep slope that should be draining, that's something that storage should be removed. But if you have, kind of playas or undulating divots in your terrain in the plains, then it could be left in. But that's something that you could refine as well, especially how much depth to use in your restart file should you choose to use it based on your calibration. As for the mesh size and alignment, some of that's going to come down to the study objective in terms of level of detail. A BLE is going to require less stringent cell sizes than a detailed study or urbanized, where you're going to want to go smaller. But then your watershed properties, whether you have steep channels and narrow corridors, might merit smaller cell sizes than if you're on the plains, so you could open that up. But ultimately that's yet another one where you could refine it, and perhaps only on select stretches rather than throughout your whole model. Same with structures, how they're handled in terms of A versus AE. Typically in an A or a BLE, you're going to use a V-notch, whereas in an AE, you'll typically use an internal connection or rating curves across long areas if needed. And then for computational settings, similarly for BLE, usually it's going to be diffusion wave, and you can maybe bump up your max current a little bit to run your model a little bit faster. Whereas in if you're doing an AE with structures, you may consider using full momentum, and some of that's going to depend on slopes as well. So to summarize kind of bigger picture takeaways here, it's important that you establish clear expectations on the level of detail that's going to be required in the study objective. You should consult with any stakeholder in the process to understand what that level of detail should be, and it may vary by stream reach even within the same model. So we recommend also working with local communities and entities concerning preferred methodology. There may be guidance for that specific community in like a drainage manual, or that may vary by depending on if there's any regional authorities represented. Also, we encourage consulting historic records. I mean, remembering that the goal here is not to match that, but that would be part of setting up your model and validating it. But to actually go back and look at individual storm events to get a sense of patterns and distributions, rather than just using predictive analyses that kind of aggregate all of these results. Related to that is the fact that calibration is really key. So if you have the data to calibrate, we strongly encourage to be able to do that, because that's what's going to really drive the best representation of your modeling results. However, make sure that you're calibrating to a data source that merits being calibrated to. At times it would be inappropriate to calibrate to something with less details, such as stream stats or regressional equations, whereas your model and the initial assumptions may have given a product that is more accurate than the source that then you'd be calibrating to. So make sure you have correct data to do that with. And then lastly, document all of your assumptions that you use, because in the end, one professional engineer's judgment may vary from another, so it's important to state what you used and why you used it. The following slides summarize the more detailed findings from the hydrologic variations, which are described in a separate recording as part of Appendix A. These slides are identical to the summary that's given at the end of Appendix A. And as a reminder, hydrology is studying how much water occurs. So this section, we varied the application of water by changing the storm type, its duration, depth, and shape. But all of the hydraulic features, or how the water actually interacted with the watershed and channel, those remained fixed. This slide summarizes the observations that we've learned about duration. So regarding duration, if the duration increases or gets longer, that effect that it has on the peak discharges actually diminishes as the drainage area decreases, and then sometimes when you get into smaller drainage areas, it can actually flip it to where increasing your duration may actually give you a lower discharge. The nested hydrograph, which is duration agnostic, if you recall, it's incorporating intensities across all the durations, but it's a singular duration across 24 hours, whereas the SES Type 2 and NOAA distributions are highly influenced by the duration that's selected, and that can be a function of the regional climate and then also the drainage area properties. And one way that you can look to verify that you've selected a reasonable duration is to look for a pronounced peak in your hydrograph and to make sure that it hasn't been muted or missed, to make sure it's sufficiently long. And we'd recommend reviewing historic storms, the actual data themselves, to look at the durations that have occurred as a reference point for selecting a duration. Looking at observations now for distributions, the nested hydrograph by design is supposed to give higher peak discharges pretty much everywhere across the model because it's incorporating the highest intensities. However, even within the distribution that you select, there's a large spread across those different options, so be sure that you're selecting the right one. SES Type 2 and NOAA Quartile 1, Decile 1, they have similar resemblance to each other, and they're going to tend to yield a peak discharge that's maybe on the lower end of the spectrum for nested hydrograph, but still within that. And then obviously the other durations, like the other quartiles and deciles that aren't as drastic, will give lower results. And when a system readily drains, the peak discharges in the floodplain lists are going to be driven by those peak intensity more than the total volume or the total depth that's applied. And also this will be drastically affected by natural storage there. Essentially where even if you have a drastic quartile 1, decile 1, or quartile 4, decile 9, the degree in which that there's natural storage there will actually offset the peak discharges still. But overall, the takeaway is that the distribution shape itself is very influential in the results, so you'll want to consult the historic record and any guidance that you have on selection for this, such as the NRCS has spatial delineations, or you can use gridded ratios on depths across different durations. But we would highly recommend that you delineate your model, the basin, by the distribution type when possible, rather than trying to aggregate multiple distributions into a single basin. Looking at the observations pertaining to basin characteristics, the drainage area can increase significantly without significantly increasing the peak timing. But the timing itself can actually vary considerably in smaller basins depending on the basin's characteristics, such as its orientation, the slopes, flow paths, and the Manning's End. And we see that the maximum peak discharges, they may result from differing durations. It's not always going to be the longest, and that's going to depend again on the drainage area and its characteristics that comprise the time of concentration, and then just the degree at which the intensities vary by duration. And some of the distributions are going to be more sensitive to changes in curve number with a broader spread than others. And knowing that the antecedent moisture condition has a tremendous effect on the results, that should be chosen with care and clearly stated. And to conclude our observations, looking at the natural watershed storage, what we learned from that, that mitigating effect that it has can be really significant, and the magnitude is going to vary based on the distribution type and duration that is selected. And that effect is going to become more pronounced with increased drainage area than it would on a smaller basin, and it's going to depend on the basin characteristics itself and where it's located. That can be addressed either partially or fully. You can consume that with restart file or even with pre-processing by actually adjusting the terrain itself. But that decision to evaluate it whether to leave it in or to consume it should be based on the terrain. So example, plains with undulating terrain are what's shown here on the right. These are glacial kettles. You wouldn't see that in Colorado, but if you have that, you would leave it in. Whereas if you have steep slopes that should drain and are connected, you would want to address this issue. And in the end, this could be something that you address as part of calibrating your model and making sure to match your observed discharges. Similar to the previous section, these slides now describe the hydraulic findings that are detailed in Appendix B. And so again, they're identical to the summary given at the end of Appendix B. As a reminder, hydraulics is the flow of water, how it interacts with the watershed and channel. So for these slides, we varied the mesh size, roughness coefficient, structure types, underlying terrain, and computational settings, but all the hydrologic features or the application of water to the model, those remained fixed. This slide summarizes variations from connection type and mesh refinements. So as we all know, V-notches are the simplest to implement, but as this showed, they're actually often accurate, particularly if you implement them correctly in terms of matching the width to the actual width of your opening or the channel there and capturing the roughness appropriately. Also, we saw that peak stages, they can be significantly affected even if the discharge is not, and this is due to either the openings not conveying as much flow and kind of throttling back until that backwater is obtained and then allowing discharges to match for the peaks. Or in the case of cell size resolution or sizing, it can affect the way that the cell faces are aligned. We also saw that the run times will increase exponentially with decreasing cell size, and I think we know that intuitively, but this shows just what a degree or impact that can have. We also know that decreasing the cell size makes a hydrograph more intense. It makes it higher peak discharges, but much flashier, shorter duration. And the extent to which this occurs is going to depend on the slope, not the drainage area. So we saw anything between a 5% all the way up to a 400% increase. So it's very significant and needs to be accounted for. We also saw that splitting the cell size, so cutting them in half, will increase discharges in our study area on average by 55%, and making them quarters or reducing by 4 times increases discharges by 160% on average. So this is definitely a significant effect. So we would recommend selecting a crossing type based on the level of study and the complexity of that specific crossing, and pretty much for BLE, V-notch should be sufficient across the board, unless you have very long spans like a long underground culvert that might merit a rating curve. And then for detailed reaches or complex crossings, you could look at using an internal connection and approximating them with culvert openings. As for the cell size, that needs to be balanced based on the model size and the objectives in terms of level of study and the reach area. But this is another element that could be used as a knob during calibration when you're trying to match your peak discharges and the duration as well. This slide summarizes some of the observations regarding watershed storage and the use of restart files. So this effect, as noted also during the hydrologic variations, this effect is more pronounced as drainage area increases. And with increased restart depths, we saw how some of the variability in the hydrograph began to be muted out a bit, where increasing depth, you see less resemblance of what you see with the terrain as is or dry. Also, we saw that the run times, they increased slightly while using restart files and then significantly while using a base precip. We also saw that increased restart depths, that they'll notably increase discharges, anywhere from a few percent to even up to 20%, just varying between a 2-year depth and a 100-year depth used in the restart file, and that gap will widen between the two with increasing drainage area. And we saw that in general, the impacts across the discharge across drainage area were fairly similar, but that there was much more variability when looking at the impacts on stage. So what we would recommend is to partially or fully consume this storage based on pre-processing. This is going to be a project-specific situation. If you've got a situation like the lower right corner image, which is unlikely, but if you do have that, then leave the storage in because it's appropriate. But in most cases, some degree of pre-processing or accounting for it should be considered. And that might be whether your terrain is undulating or if you've got steep slopes that you know are going to drain. We'd also recommend that you choose a restart depth that's based on your project-specific conditions, and that could be a parameter that you dial in as part of calibration or hydro validation when you're trying to match modeled or simulated discharges to observed or recorded in gauges. And also, we would recommend that a base precip be used only during the trial runs while you're changing your mesh a fair amount. It's an easier way to do it, but that once your geometry is finalized, to revert to using a restart file. This slide summarizes some of the observations about varying terrain and computational settings. The first one, for using a coarser terrain of 8 foot versus 2 foot, it does slightly increase the discharges, stage, and floodplains, but it reduces the run times moderately and the file size significantly and is worth considering. There's essentially no difference when using diffusion wave between a max current of 1.5 and 5, at least not for this study area, except it did run faster, so might as well embrace that, the 5 max current for diffusion wave. Now, for diffusion wave versus full momentum, there were some minor differences, nothing that would be meaningful for BLE though. However, if doing a detailed study, it would be worth considering, especially if you have structures. But do note that the full momentum does more than double your run times. So what we'd recommend is just using a standard 8 to 10 foot resolution size, and you could consider reducing it if needed for specific narrow detailed drainages where that additional resolution is beneficial. And then also we'd recommend running BLE using a max current of 5 for diffusion wave, and that full momentum would be reserved for detailed reaches that have structures. And on the right here, we're showing some of the adjustable time step criteria that we would use. This slide summarizes observations from Manning's N and breakline variations. So we saw that if you apply uniform changes across the entire land cover to Manning's N assignments, that it will affect your discharges, but not the stage, because the impact on the discharge is actually going to cancel out the impact on your stage. So when you increase the Manning's N, that's going to give you less intense hydrographs. You'll have a longer hydrograph, but with a reduced peak. But then you'll have increased resistance, so it'll be lower flows, higher resistance, about the same stage. We saw, at least on average, that a 20% increase in N values across the watershed gave about a 20% decrease in flow, whereas a 20% decrease in N values gave about a 10% increase in flow. As for break lines, we found that the alignment relative to the stream center line did not actually seem very influential. Again, it's highly influential for ridge lines and any high ground, but when it came to the stream center line from a hydraulic standpoint, it actually did not impact the values much. It would impact your mapping and troubleshooting, but it won't impact the values. So what we'd recommend is varying the detail of Manning's N based on the data that's available to do so, to make those decisions, based also on how much the land use varies, and then also based on the level of study. So in a typical BLE, we're comfortable just using the National Land Cover Database and shifting the moderate values uniformly, up by 5% or down by 5% as needed for matching flows as part of hydrovalidation. Now in a detailed study, we might start with the National Land Cover, we might not use it at all, but regardless, you'd want to modify that data set with overrides and changing those values locally as well in order to match your stage values that you would expect. Regarding break lines, we just recommend using a stream breakline approach that is based on your mapping and your troubleshooting needs, whatever is appropriate in that project setting, but it won't be driven by hydraulic accuracy. Thank you for watching this recording. If you found it helpful, I suggest that you also consider watching Appendix A and B for further detail. And if you want more information, please reach out to CWCB, specifically either to Tweet Patton or Tamarta Blanco Castaño with their contact information shown below. Thank you.